Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this talk at Unsound. We are here to talk about Kate Molleson's book, which is just here, and there's a few copies on the merch stand, Sound Within Sound, which has recently been published by Faber. My name is Jennifer Lucy Allan, and I'm a broadcaster and a writer from the UK. I write for The Guardian and The Wire and The Quietus, and I present Late Junction on BBC Radio 3. And Kate is also a Radio 3 presenter. She's a journalist and broadcaster too. She presents Radio 3's New Music Show and Music Matters. They're both really good shows, which you should check out. She's made documentaries that for the BBC Radio that investigated music in Greenland, opera in Mongolia, lost recordings of Arabic classical music, and the Ethiopian nun and pianist and composer Emohoi Segwe Mariam Gabru, who we'll probably be talking a bit about in this talk. She's written for The Guardian, New Statesman, Prospect, BBC Music Magazine, Opera Gramophone, and a bunch of others. And she was also commissioning editor of Dear Green Sounds, which was a history of Glasgow's music venues commissioned by UNESCO. So, what we're going to talk about today is Kate's book. And the first place that I want to start, actually, is with the introduction, because there is kind of a manifesto for what you're trying to do with the book in that introduction. So can you lay that out for us?
Thank you. It's really terrific to be here, especially, gosh, what a beautiful city and such a beautiful time of year. I'm so thrilled to be here. And yes, I think what you're referring to is probably a line in the introduction which says that I wrote this book out of love and anger. And I suppose, unsurprisingly, that's been picked up quite a lot because they are strong emotions, but it felt very true. Love, because I really come from a classical music background. That was the music I fell in love with when I was a tiny little girl, listening to the radio in my parents' kitchen in rural Scotland. And I fell in love with the stories around the music as well as the music itself. And I followed those stories really all the way through my childhood. And as I started studying music more seriously, I think one of the things I loved is that the music always seemed radical to me. The music I was hearing in Beethoven, in Brahms, in Monteverdi and Bach, I always felt this music was thrilling, exciting, daring, dangerous. And that's not a word that I think is associated with classical music enough. And also, the stories, these lives of these so-called great composers, which get told to us and retold to us. And I found those thrilling too, but then I wanted more, and I wanted to follow this music into the 20th century and onwards into, now the 21st century. And then I started to get a bit frustrated because I felt that danger was starting to slip away, and I was always reading about the same sorts of people and the same names were recurring all the time. And as I looked beyond the mainstream narrative that I was being fed in my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees, and the names that I kept finding in the music festival, the classical music festivals, the main orchestral festivals and opera houses. Of course there were others. And that's when the anger started to creep in, is why were these others being left out? Why was it so hard to search out their stories? And why was the narrative presented as though it was only really one type of person that was making this music, and that type of person was white and male and probably European or American? And I think it's hard to find people who don't fit that description before, let's say, 1900. Of course there are some, and we must hear their music. But from the 20th century onwards, there was an explosion of creativity and people who were able to make their voices heard in many different ways. And those are the stories that I think have been left out, and that really were the starting point for this book. So that's the provocation, I suppose, that you're talking about in the introduction. I mean, it's hilarious in a way talking at a festival like this, which is very much attuned to experimental sound and to the idea that people from diverse backgrounds might be making those sounds. But really, within the classical music world, it's still a point that needs to be made. I think in the 2019 to 2020 orchestral seasons worldwide, 8% of concerts had music written by a woman in them. 8%. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Mm. So can you give us a bit of a rundown of, because the thing that I always felt about this book is that it could be a book that never sort of finishes itself, because there are obviously people who deserve to be in it, who are making music, who are hearing about all the time, who are being sort of put back into the history books. But you've got 10 in here. Is it 10?
It is 10.
So can you kind of give us a rundown of as many of those as you can remember off the top of your head?
Yeah, obviously it was a huge decision who to bring in and who to, well, not who to leave out, and that was an important starting point as well. I wasn't trying to write an encyclopedia of alternative names. I think the word alternative is problematic because it suggests that there is a kind of inarguable core, and I want to question that. So I've not used the word alternative. I've not tried to make a grand chronology of the 20th century of all the radical composers I can think of. I simply tried to choose 10 composers who I think are fascinating in themselves and whose music is amazing for many different reasons, but also who hopefully offer a lens onto bigger stories, maybe represent bigger themes, maybe themes that connect through the book. So we start with a Mexican composer called Julián Carrillo, who was a microtonalist right back at the beginning of the 20th century. And what does he offer a lens onto? Many. I mean, he was an unbelievably charismatic, polemical, cantankerous, problematic figure in his own right. He picked arguments with everybody and anybody. He was always on the wrong side of political fashion. I think, I'm told that his role in Mexican musical history is still pretty complicated, which I liked. He wasn't an easy, glossy character to write about. But anyway, his investigations of microtonalism at a time when composers were doing that around the world, the beginning of the 20th century, sort of questioning what the future of new classical music would be. And he had a very unique Mexican lens on that story. He also was an indigenous composer. He was from an indigenous family in a rural part of Mexico, and I think that conversation around the role of folk music in a new kind of nationalism, he taps into those kinds of themes. So you've got, start with Julián Carrillo. At the other end of the book, we have Anea Lockwood, who you know very well.
Actually, we did a talk with Anea. Anyone who was here last year, I did one remotely on this stage with Anea. So.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, an absolutely beautiful composer from New Zealand, for those who don't know her, who now lives in the United States. And I love finishing the book with her because I think, in a way, she really subverts the idea of what a composer even is, because so much of her craft is about listening rather than about asserting her notion of genius onto the page in any way. I mean, it's about discovering the sounds that are around us and that are innate in objects in nature within our own bodies. So there's a huge range of creative theories and ideals going on between among the composers between those two sort of polarities, I suppose. But yeah.
And in the middle, there's Emma Hoy, who we mentioned at the start,
right.
and Elsa Marie Prada, and Eliane Radigue, and Muhal Richard Abrams.
Good on you. You remember better than I do. That's fantastic. Yeah, so I wanted a geographical spread. I mean, that's by no means ticking every box. That was not the point, but I did want to investigate, for example, Jose Maceda, who is a Filipino composer who is involved in making absolutely enormous situational participatory pieces in the 1970s, 60s, 70s. We could maybe come back to one of my favorite new music happenings sort of ever, which he staged using 20 radio stations in the city of Manila in 1974.
If nobody, maybe I'd never even heard of this, and it sounded like one of the most ambitious and sort of wide-reaching projects that has kind of that happened in the 20th century. And I'd never heard of it. So tell us about.
Okay,
so I'm presuming actually maybe not everybody in the room's heard about it. So tell us about that.
It's mad that we haven't heard about it, given the scale of it. I cannot think of a bigger musical happening. Maybe somebody can think of one, but certainly not an avant-garde musical happening that involved the entire population of Manila. as both listeners and performers. So this was a piece written by Meseda for 20 radio stations. Each radio station was going to be broadcasting a different part of the piece, pre-recorded tracks of indigenous Filipino instruments. And the way that this piece would work is that between 6 and 7 p.m. on New Year's Day, 1974, citizens of Manila were basically required, encouraged to come out onto the streets with portable radios to tune in to any one of the local radio stations. Actually, there were 37 stations, so some of them doubled up. And tune into one of the stations, each one would be broadcasting a different part, and then you just walk around for the hour and you hear this enormous piece. It was this kind of huge cloud of sound, and depending on which station you were tuned into and which one I was, every one of these people was going to have a different experience of this enormous piece. So not only was it sort of millions of listeners and performers, it was also a bespoke experience for every one of those people. I mean, it's mind-blowing in its scale and its audacity. There is
complicated by the political situation that allowed that to happen.
Not insignificant was the fact. Well, how do you get, wouldn't that be great to restage this piece? But the small problem is, how do you get 20 radio stations to say, okay, we'll broadcast nothing but one part of Ugnayan, this piece, for the next hour, which obviously isn't going to happen. But what Meseda had on his side, or who, was Imelda Marcos. Why would this piece fit into the Marcos regime's ideals is quite an interesting conversation. And it's to do, I think, with the fact that they saw this collective endeavor making this piece of music together, all these millions of people, as suitable to the ideals of the regime. And so Meseda had to make a decision. Maybe decision is putting it too strongly, as to whether he would collaborate, be co-opted by the regime, which he did. And, in some sense, you could say it's the only way he could get the piece done. I think that's made his legacy quite complicated in the Philippines. I spoke to Filipino musicologists about that, and they said, yeah, it is complicated because Meseda is actually an extremely well-known national figure in the Philippines. There's a department named after him at the University of the Philippines. He kind of founded ethnomusicology there. Very important national figure. A very mild-mannered, thoughtful individual. And yet, his biggest achievement was one that was very much co-opted by the Marcos regime, which is not a history that is, I understand, in high favor with a lot of modern liberal Filipinos. So always political complications around the music. And to be honest, as a writer, that makes it all the juicier.
We're not just talking about composers here, and what I'm getting at here is, can we talk about Walter Smetak's instruments?
Sure, yeah.
Because I love them.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about, tell us a bit about him and his instrument making, and he's this kind of wild figure as well.
Yeah, actually, fun fact, which I came across in the writing, was that Meseda and Smetak knew each other and had hung out.
Wow.
These are some of the intersections. I was really determined when I started not to try to be reductive and force connections between these composers. That I felt too often in histories you kind of try to shoehorn connections in and try to force similarities between people who were doing radically different things all over the world. And yet these themes kept on recurring and coincidences kept coming up. And then here I learned that in 1968, I think, Jose Meseda went and spent a bit of time in Salvador de Bahia in northeast Brazil, where this crazy instrument inventor called Walter Smetak was living and working, and they actually knew each other. And Meseda took home some materials from Brazil and left some materials in Brazil. So that was a nice intersection. Anyway, Smetak was a cellist from Switzerland who went to Brazil just before the Second World War. He felt he had reason to leave Europe at that time, 1937, I think it was. And I liked his story for many, many reasons, but one of them was because I think it subverts what is a common trope in classical music narratives, which is somebody from maybe the global south or perceived remote parts of the world, comes to Europe and has their musical epiphany and, develops the skills required to become a genius composer or whatever. For Smetak, it was completely the opposite. He was regular cellist in Europe, and he goes to Brazil and has this amazing spiritual and musical awakening that never would have occurred had he not gone there. He goes to Salvador de Bahia, which is a vibrantly multicultural city, one of the most multicultural cities in the world, explosively dynamic in its music and its creativity. And he gets involved in a very kind of niche form of theosophy, Brazilian theosophy. And he also gets a job as as an instrument mender, actually, in the university. He has a workshop down in the basement of the university in Salvador de Bahia. He's mending cellos and things. And then he starts inventing instruments that sort of channel the spirituality and the kind of cosmic ley lines and everything. It's all very astral. But the stuff he comes up with is absolutely fascinating. These amazing, bizarre, very thoughtful microtonal performative instruments. And there's a fascinating intersection in what he's doing and the sort of nascent radical pop music movement that is Tropicalia, because some of the main protagonists of Tropicalia are from Salvador de Bahia as well, and he really inspires them in the experimental sounds that they would go on to make. So again, some really fun. A really fun kind of fervent, creative moment in Brazil. And there the political backdrop is also fascinating, and looming is another authoritarian regime. So often in this book there is a kind of vibrant creativity against the backdrop of authoritarianism.
The instrument that I think really stayed with me was it's Smetak who made the kind of flute for a very, very long flute that's designed for like 20 people to play at once. But then when he tried to get everyone to play it, everyone was different heights. So they had to sort of like get loads of chairs and kind of do this almost like performative kind of bodge on the players. And I really loved the idea, the sort of clarity of idea, but then with the way it operates in the world is also unpredictable. Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, it's beautifully put, actually, because, a lot of kind of...
There's one that you mentioned that's your favourite. I can't remember which one it is.
Oh, gosh, which was it?
There's one with loads of...
There's a lot of star symbology involved. And actually, maybe my actual favourite is one that never got built. It's a studio, the Espacio Ovo, I think it's called, a kind of egg-shaped studio that he imagined people would experience sound from within. And it was a kind of total work concept that sadly never got built. It remained silent, but it was going to channel his complete philosophical and musical notions. He died before it could be built.
An egg shape
that we would all be inside.
Did that have a significance, I guess?
Yes, eggs. There's a lot to do with fertility in oibios, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is this Brazilian form of theosophy. So yeah, all connected to female fertility.
I wish we were in an egg-shaped studio now. So the other thing that I, as a writer, reading your book, that I sort of had these moments where I was like, oh, it's really, really good writing, like really nice details, is that in the book, I recognise that you're really drawing portraits of these composers as people, not just as sort of music makers and composers. And there's a lot of kind of personal details, to the point at which, like, there's their relationship with their parents in about a lot of people. And was there a reason why you wanted to include those things and paint those sorts of portraits rather than kind of more straight musical biographies, I guess?
It's interesting that it's even comment-worthy, isn't it? I mean, you're right. I did have to make that decision. I think it's comment-worthy within the sphere of writing about music, but elsewhere it wouldn't be. I think for people out with the world of music and maybe new music, it can be very intimidating, and it can be hard to get a kind of way in. And so anything that I feel could offer that way in is very useful.
I wondered if my recognising that also is partly to do with not always reading my favourite musicians and composers, you know, who are not part of like the canon, however you want to call it, or the establishment. And actually me realising I don't know anything about these people's childhoods, because they're like not really, it's people like Beethoven who we want to know, who are or have been written, every detail about their lives has been written, whereas the people that are not considered part of that sort of establishment or canon, or however you want to call that sort of mainstream attention, are not like deemed worthy, even within the places that are writing about them, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I also think, I mean, I'm genuinely curious how composers, how musicians become the radical selves that they do. So a composer like Anea Lockwood, her upbringing, in a way, it could be seen as very conventional. She grew up in New Zealand in a, let's say, middle-class family. She went as a pianist and composer to the Royal College of Music in London. I mean, I have this image of her as very, and you see interviews with her in the 1960s, and she's wearing these very neat skirts and tops, and her hair is done beautifully, and you know, it's this kind of antithesis to what might be perceived as this troublemaker. You know, soon she would set fire to a piano and scandalize the musical world. So how does that transition happen? And so I suppose I am really fascinated in what sows the seed of radicalism in a musician. And Anea, I asked Anea that because we have the great fortune of being able to talk to her, and she said she pinpointed her parents and the fact that her father would take her and her brother on great adventures in the New Zealand wilderness. They would climb mountains and camp out and cross these huge raging rivers. And so that was one aspect, is there was an adventurousness that was permitted in her family. But another really significant factor was that she was a woman, and it was the 1960s. And although there were women writing symphonies, it was not easy. There were still a lot of obstacles. And I think she felt that, in a way, there was another option for her that sort of circumnavigated all the politics of the sort of the establishment that she would have to fight against, and she really couldn't be bothered with that. And couple that with the fact that she has this forensic ear and this astute fascination for sound, and she wanted to investigate that to its core. So anyway, the point you make about personal details, I think, is a really important one. A final thing I would say about that is I am not really interested in artists and musicians, composers as geniuses that are untouchable or that are in any way different from anybody else. I think there's a kind of democratization that needs to happen around creativity. And I think we need to stop treating creative people as though there is some sort of innate genius that is untouchable or unexplainable. Because that perpetuates a very unhelpful myth, which can permit very bad behavior, as we can all sort of think of examples of that. But it can also suggest that certain people are allowed into creativity and certain people aren't. And I think that's another big point in the book.
Yeah. So also in the book, you're talking about you were able to talk to Anea Lockwood, and you actually met quite a number of the people that you're writing about. But there's a beautiful encounter with Emma Hoy and with Eliane as well. But did any of those meetings, or when you got the chance to interview people, did any of those really stay with you or kind of change your thinking?
Yes, absolutely, they all did. And it's an amazing privilege to meet somebody like Eliane Radigue, who I had the chance to meet a few times. And each time the conversation deepened and expanded my mind hugely. Yeah, I mean, life-changing for me, but I think also extremely important in understanding her music for me. I understood her music in a completely different way. getting to know the sort of conviction that she has as a person. In a way, I understood how she could write these. If you don't know Eliane Radigue's music, well, for starters, it's very slow, and it's often very long form. It's extremely patient, sort of virtuosic in its patience. Whether it's the music that she wrote for synthesizers since the 1970s, or the music she's been working on with musicians, instrumental musicians, since the turn of the 21st century. Virtuosic in its quietness and its slowness. And it's not something that I can really relate to in my frenetic and sort of over busy life. And it was amazing to talk to her about her choices in life more broadly and her spirituality. Again, she became a Buddhist in the 1970s, and although she doesn't directly attribute her music to her spirituality, I think it's certainly an important background factor. And so those sort of dynamics, I think, were really important for me to have a deeper understanding of what was going on in her practice.
I want to ask you a bit more about the research, actually, because one of the issues when doing a heavy amount of research on somebody who has been excluded or erased or omitted, what sort of issues were you coming up against when writing this in terms of...
Not enough material. I mean, not a lot of material, especially in English, written about many of these composers. In a way, that was a gift, though, because it allowed me to contact people in each of the relevant countries and ask questions. I'm not an academic, but I'm a journalist. I know who to phone up, or how to get the numbers of the right people to phone up. I was also writing this book during lockdown, mainly. So I didn't do as much of the traveling as I'd hoped to, but also that meant that I probably sat in my room and actually wrote the thing, which was, more effective. But what was the biggest, revelation for me was how generous musicologists and musicians were across the world in supporting me in this project, whether it was a musicologist called Alejandro Madrid, who's the Carrillo expert, who was willing to talk to me multiple times over Zoom, answer my questions, read my drafts, explain to me the politics of Mexico in the 1920s that I couldn't have known as a Scottish person sitting in Edinburgh trying to write this book. Same story in Manila in the Philippines, same story in Brazil. So that was very humbling how generous researchers were with their materials and their time. And I sort of wondered why people were being so generous in helping me do this. And the answer I got was from a Brazilian musicologist who said, it's been so lost, this book is so overdue. We are so fed up reading the Western-centric accounts of classical music that completely ignore what's been happening, in his case, in Brazil, for the last century. Why has nobody shone a light on this creativity? So we're really glad that you're doing it. So there was so much goodwill behind it that I relied on, and I hope that I've acknowledged that enough. It really feels like a collective effort, actually.
Were there instances where you were digging it? Was there anyone in particular where you sort of found that there were, because we use language like left out of the history books or omitted, when in some cases there's a sort of active erasure happening? And was there anybody where you found there were intentional? I'm thinking of Ruth Crawford Seeger, actually.
Okay, it's a really interesting question. And I think taps into specific national narratives in really interesting ways. I would also bring up Carrillo in this instance, actually. I mentioned earlier that his place in Mexican musical history is complicated. As I understand, that's partly because in the 1920s, there was a big conversation going, 1930s, there was a big conversation going on after the Mexican Revolution about what the new Mexico would look and sound like, and music was a part of that. And there was a sort of mainstream aesthetic that was emerging that was to do with a sort of assimilated identity, which suited the politics of the time really well. So this idea that everybody in Mexico, in the new modern Mexico, lived together happily under one flag, and whether you were a Mexican Indian or a kind of European descendant, that was all one kind of mestizo, I think is the word, identity, which of course wasn't the case, and as I understand it, still isn't the case. But it suited the authorities at the time for composers to be writing, say, a symphony that sort of included some vaguely indigenous folk-sounding melodies that would tick that box of a kind of grand assimilation. Julian Carrillo refused to do that, even though he himself was a Mexican Indian person. So that's a really interesting example of not playing the game, not fitting the kind of fashionable political identity of the time, and making life really complicated for himself. And I would say being left out partly because of that. Ruth Crawford Seeger, who you just brought up, is...
She's one of the people who, and there's a few instances of this sort of recurring theme, particularly for the female composers, to do with sort of gender expectations, yes, basically around domesticity and motherhood.
Absolutely, yeah. Motherhood, in the case of Ruth Crawford Seeger, who was a phenomenally bold and searching composer in the 1920s. I mean, there's another example of why did she become this courageous, bold person that she did. She was a Methodist minister's daughter. Very well-behaved upbringing, was going to be a piano teacher. That was what her mother had ambitions for her to do, because that's what a woman could do in the 1920s. And then she sort of got radicalized in Chicago, which was a hotbed of bohemianism in the 20s. And she went off to Berlin on her own, intent on studying sort of a high point of Germanic modernism. And she wrote a couple of unbelievably forward-thinking pieces, her string quartet, 1931, and her three chants for women's voices, beautiful, which are incredible pieces, still extremely modern and, decades ahead of their time. And then she comes back to the United States and she marries her teacher, Charles Seeger, who happened to be the father of Pete Seeger, who would grow up to be the famous folk singer. And they have 4 kids together, including Peggy Seeger, who is also a character in this book. And she stops composing, pretty much stops composing. And why did she? I couldn't wrap my head around why a woman who had been so ambitious and courageous and independent would accept. I mean, her husband, Charles Seeger, had this idea that women couldn't write symphonies. He was very snooty about this. What was going on behind the scenes there was almost certainly the fact that he was jealous because she was a much better composer than he was. But she accepted it. She had her kids, she stopped composing. Again, a political backdrop there was the fact that it was the Great Depression in the United States, and there was a strong feeling amongst a lot of the left-wing artists that modernist music didn't really fit the ideals of the proletariat. And so the only way to go really was to get involved in folk music, which she did. And she became the foremost, I suppose, transcriber of folk music. So Alan and John Lomax were traveling across the United States, collecting folk song recordings on shellac and bringing them back to Ruth, who would transcribe them absolutely meticulously with great reverence for the material, which is very important work as well. But what never was allowed to happen was for her to investigate what, for example, Bartók was doing in Hungary, which was marrying modernism with folk music in a way that had genuine respect for both fields. After a couple of decades of having kids and watching them grow up, and they were almost grown up, she decided that, you know what, now's the time. I think I can go back to this. And then, tragically, she died of cancer before she was able to really do that. So that story is really one of the great what-ifs. What if she had been able to marry those two fields of knowledge that she had developed? We'll never really know, but I had a wonderful time speaking to her daughter, Peggy, who is an amazing character, and answered a lot of my questions.
It's worth noting she performed at your book launch.
She did.
A couple of months ago, and
Yeah.
One of my friend was there as well, and at the end was actually in floods of tears. I've very rarely seen anybody react with, she just said, it's quite a lot, isn't it? Like, and it really was. The stories of, because you find there's this these sort of very personal reflections that are completely intertwined with the music. It's not music about her mother. It is like with and in the sort of, the connections are, you can't split those things up.
Absolutely. And one thing that Peggy spoke a lot about to me in very candid detail was what she thinks are inherited traits we inherit from our parents in terms of gender dynamics, how we treat each other. And she was very open, because I was asking her, why did Ruth act, why did she give up? Why did she agree to what, just because her husband was telling her to do this? I was kind of seeing it from my feminist 2022 lens. I couldn't understand what would make a woman stop. And Peggy is so wise. She said, well, first of all, you can't retrospectively impose your feminist ideals from now on to what a woman was choosing to do at that time. But also she could see it in herself, because Peggy's own story is, she married another folk singer called Ewan MacColl, who wrote a very famous song about her. First Time Ever I Saw Your Face was about Peggy Seeger. And they ended up having quite a difficult marriage, which she's written about. So this is in the public domain. I don't mind sharing this. But it took Peggy a long time to develop her own sense of feminism and to, I guess, escape from that marriage, which finally and wonderfully happened when she fell in love with her best friend, who was called Irene. And now they have a wonderful time together. And Peggy's just extremely wise in talking about, in forgiving herself for not knowing then what she knows now. And that's her way of understanding her mother's story as well. She didn't have the benefit of knowing what we know now as women. And that was a really good corrective to me in trying to understand a lot of the stories around the women and the choices that they had to make in this book. Eliane Radigue is another one. I was trying to understand what it was like to be at the forefront of electronic music composition, musique concrète, in the 1950s. She was working in studios with Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. These were very male environments. She's happy to admit that. And she's just very kind of philosophical about the shit that she had to put up with. And she just sort of, she's very accepting about the virtuosic navigations that she had to make in order to basically get what she wanted, which was access to the equipment in the studios.
Yeah. So the first time I talked to you about this book was when it had, maybe even the day it came out, I think. And since then you said, you've been kind of talking about it and it's been out in the world. What sort of responses have you had? And has there, because we're out on Sound, which is a very sort of forward-thinking, open-minded space where we don't have sort of opinions about what music should be, but this is also part of the sort of more traditional establishment classical music crowd. So what have the reactions been like? Because it operates across all these different spheres.
Very good question. Interesting responses, some absolutely lovely responses, and I've been really blown away by what readers are bringing to it and their own intersections, and some really great starting points. Because a lot of the chapters could also be contained within histories of folk music or improv or jazz. There's a chapter about Muhal Richard Abrams, who's a composer I really wanted to include because he chose to include himself in classical music lineage, and that's important. So a lot of beautiful reactions, and then some interestingly negative reactions from certain more right-wing publications, questioning my choice to include certain composers within the sphere of classical music, which, frankly, I think proves my point.
Because you do talk in the introduction, you talk about, like, within the classical music world, there being a perceived threat from inclusion, as if it's not just, like you say, as if Beethoven's sort of what we think of Beethoven is going to be threatened by including somebody like Eliane or Muha Richard Abrams in our histories, which seems absurd. I mean, I think it does seem absurd to anybody in this room.
I almost feel like I need to just give a crash course in what the classical music world can be like to this room, which is probably so open-minded. But yes, I mean, in order how do I explain why this could be problematic to include certain of these figures under this extremely huge umbrella term that I'm using, which is classical music. And some questions have been asked to me reasonably, what even is classical music? And I think it's a very big, open-ended answer, which has to do with infrastructure, status, funding, the kind of narratives that we're discussing, the kind of politics around the music. I think the term itself is so vague and so huge that you could say it becomes meaningless, but I don't think it does become meaningless in real terms when you're filling in that application form or when you're being accepted into that festival. George Lewis, who's a composer who helped me a lot with this book, writes a wonderful history of the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which is a force for immense change and radical music making in originally the south side of Chicago and now has moved to New York as well. He writes specifically about the importance of genre labels. In that history, he talks about the politics around being left out of, in the case of a lot of those musicians, jazz, because the music they were making was perceived to be too cerebral for jazz, whatever that means. But these guys were too black to be classical, too cerebral to be jazz. So where do they go? You know, in some senses, that would mean they wouldn't be allowed into any platforms. They would slip through the net of certain media outlets, of certain, funding opportunities. So it is really important. So I think it was quite telling, some of the reactions I got to the book. One publication absolutely loathed it from start to finish. I'm not sure the guy read the book, but he did. What were the words he hated? He hated. He said that a love of music is worth less in this world than inflated notions of race and gender. He said, our old friend, I don't know, it was words like diversity, environment, empowerment that really got his goat. Fine, I can't deny that those words come up in this book. They do.
But have there been any positive? I mean, not just people liking the book, but have you had any other sort of impacts, I guess?
Yeah, some really lovely impacts. And this is part of why I wanted to write it, is because I hope, actually, part of the reason to write it was because we both work for Radio 3. I think we both know the genuine desire to diversify the music that is played on that station. I mean, there was genuine desire, but we can't play what doesn't, I'm not going to say what doesn't exist, but what isn't available, or what isn't easily available. I think Late Junction is one of the programs that does probably more legwork than any other in terms of tracking down the recordings, even if they're really bloody hard to find or license or whatever. But I also work on some of the more sort of mainstream daytime programs like The Breakfast Show. And we are really trying to diversify the playlist. We really are. But in the heat of the moment, it's 5 to 7 in the morning. Blearily, you're trying to find a track which is 4 minutes and 37 seconds long exactly. And I'm going, but we must, I'd love to play something by, a Filipino woman. And my producer down the line's going, yeah, that's great, but do we have a recording that is available, that is licensed, that is good enough quality, that is this, that, and the other? And
I think this brings up this question I wanted to ask about, which is actually one of the biggest challenges, especially for the sort of, for many of the people in the book, is the idea of repertoire, and how important that is within classical music. Because if it's not part of repertoire, then it doesn't get performed, which means it doesn't get recorded. So there's the sort of the question of diversifying and sort of opening up the possibilities for classical music is actually at its core has this idea, has sort of access to scores and the idea of repertoire, and that means people program it. So it's this kind of which you don't really have, so it doesn't impact other types of music as much in terms of, you can find music by this band or musician and you play it, but within classical music, there's a much bigger infrastructure that has to sort of kick into play to sort of take that positive action. That's it's really annoying that it doesn't happen. I find it annoying.
You've put your finger on it. I think that's a huge part of what I hoped telling the stories would be a first step in the direction, tell the stories, people find out about the music that is there. I mean, I've had, you asked some of the positive impacts, people getting in touch saying, oh wow, I read that Julian Criot has 13 string quartets. I want my string quartet to play them. How do I do this? The music is not published, so I can put that person in touch with the musicologist who knows everything about Criot, and then he's working on having the music published. The quartet can play it. Hopefully they record it. Hopefully it becomes much more available. That's the kind of very practical impacts that I would love to see. But on your point about infrastructure, again, this is the real stuff. This is the fact that publishers have, in talking about has it been willful exclusion, I think in some cases there is a very real reason to perpetuate the mainstream, the core, because it is around performance rights and if publishers who continue to publish books on certain composers, their music gets played, the royalties come in. It's real and it's practical. And yes, those who have been left out. It's very expensive to make a recording of a string quartet, let alone a symphony, let alone an opera. These opportunities aren't afforded to all but the extremely fortunate.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make. So before I open it up to questions, I think the subtitle of the book is it opening up? I was actually going to have it on my knee.
Our ears.
Opening our ears to the 20th century. So, and I guess my final question then is this book as much about listening as it is making music?
Yes, that's a very Anea Lockwood question, isn't it?
Yes, I'm a fan.
Yeah, I think so. I think Anea can be our lead here.
It's perfect because last year there was the festival, the closing event at the festival was a piano burning. So
here,
yeah,
I should know that. That's wonderful. Where did it happen?
In a kind of sort of field park, sort of not that far away. I don't know what the name of it was.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, there you go. So the spirit of Anea is very much here. I think she leads by example. She is such an alert and generous listener. And again, talking about that democratization of creativity, she's so generous in suggesting that actually it's on us. It's on us to be attentive and to care about what we're listening to. She draws our attention to, for example, the sound of rivers in these beautiful long-form river maps that she makes with such love for the sound, the thing that is making the sound, in that case, underwater life, or the life of the riverbanks around and the ecosystem around them. She's tentative to call herself an activist, an environmental activist, but she absolutely bloody is, because in drawing our attention to the thing that makes the sound, we care more about that thing, whether that's each other or ourselves, our own bodies, our own breath, the river, the environment, the piano. That's why the burning of the piano is the opposite of an act of violence. It's an act of love. That's why you can't see this, but this little circle here, there's Anea looking ultra cool with this burning piano behind her. I love that she's my cover star. So yeah, I think it is about listening, and it's about putting the onus on us. The onus is not on these composers to make their voices heard. It's on us to be open to the sounds that they're making. And another point that I was told by somebody in Brazil, he said, one thing that would be really great is if Western listeners could stop trying to either make everybody sound like something you already know. Say you want more black composers in your programs. Don't only choose the ones that write music like the stuff you already know, because that's extremely prescriptive. And then also don't try to kind of exotify all the time and make them write music that you think needs to be written by somebody from this part of the world or that part of the world. Just be open. Let people write music of their own life experience as it is lived around the world. That's being genuinely open. So I suppose that was a key lesson in this as well. Is, you know, if we really want genuine diversity if we want genuine diversity, we're going to have to be open to genuine diversity of sound. And again, saying that at a festival like Unsound seems like a no-brainer, but it's not necessarily a no-brainer in a lot of sectors of the musical world.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think we've touched on loads of quite big issues and also great stories about composers. But does anyone have any questions? There may or may not be a microphone floating around, but if you shout, I'll repeat. Yes.
To your point, Kate, about diversifying playlists, for example, on
Yeah.
Radio 3 on BBC. First thing I want to say, I admire what you're both doing in that area greatly. Both the music that gets played on the radio.
Thank you. And the music that gets written about in various publications that you both write for. How can we make it easier for... Because it feels like a lot of the onus is on you as broadcasters and writers to sort of discover this music that's out there. But if, for example, you are, I don't know, an experimental composer living here in Krakow, how does one get their music played on Radio 3? Because you can't really just email... I mean, you can email late attention.
You can,
but you
and
never hear
everyone's on
back.
Twitter. And also, I think Bandcamp is really, really good for this, because if I'm doing a themed show, say around, like I did a bagpipe show or something, and I'm looking for tags. So what I would say, if you are trying to get your music heard, like I use those search tags like a lot. So make sure you tag your music with, even just. Sometimes I think, I wonder what this experimental scene is like in this city. I'm like trying to get a picture for what's happening all over the world. And I kind of just bounce around via the tags. And I know that I'm missing loads because some people don't use tags or you use like vague ones. So I would just actually kind of use them in a simple way. The other thing that I have a real problem with at the moment is that, yeah, sure, I'm answering when you're asking Kate here, but just because I've got a real bee in my bonnet at the moment about, I get hundreds of emails a day in my inbox of music, and I'm covering, and for the places that I cover, I'm kind of covering experimental and avant-garde music. Basically, the sort of stuff that would be on at Unsound is like exactly my bag, which is really broad. And I'm writing about a spread in all ways, as much as possible, in what I cover. But the PR that I'm getting is overwhelmingly lacking diversity. There's this one PR that I really don't like. So he sends 8 emails at once, all at once. And
I know who you're talking about.
Yes, and every single one of them is a European man making electronic music. Every single one, every week. There's maybe 1 or 2, here and there. And there's something there. Every Friday, you get this like 5 p.m. batch clogging up my inbox. And every time I draft an email being like, you need to, all of these are white men from Europe making electronic music. Like, what, you need to sort out your list. Like, this is not...
Do you send that email?
No, I always delete it.
Why? We've got to the moment. Why send that goddamn email?
I think I need to write an open letter to him. I did once say, can you not send
right here, right now.
He might even be here because he knows
who you are.
yeah. But I think there's a point that you're making, which is about that. If you are making work, if you are programming a festival, if you are writing about music, if you're doing a radio show, it is accepted now that everybody, this makes it more interesting. You want it to be diverse. You want there to be an openness of opportunity, and it makes everything better and more interesting. There's no threat to anything. It's not bad. This is accepted. We all know this. But behind that, in the infrastructure, even in sort of experimental music where loads of people don't even have labels, there's those people are not counting. And I do some bio writing for artists, and there's one PR at a label, and it's kind of just outside of what I would write about. It's kind of sort of synth poppy type things. And she's on a Facebook group, and she's like, I keep asking you to do stuff because I'm on this sort of professional networking group where somebody says, oh, I need somebody to write a bio for this person. Bios are not bylined, so every single suggestion is a male writer. And she was like, so I'm just starting to try and collect, you know, like female non-binary writers to suggest, because I'm just noticing this recurrence. And that's actually that has impact on income, because you get really well paid for those things. So there's all these things that I'm starting to notice, which, if on the surface everybody's doing lots of work and it's brilliant and things are better, but that secondary thing that is invisible, where nobody's counting and nobody's really, it's invisible to a general listener or music fan, that it's not happening there. I don't know. So anyway, what do you think, Kate? Sorry.
Say it, sister. No, you're so right. There's loads to add. This is a huge conversation. I suppose without getting into the nitty-gritty, the thing is also make your voice heard. I mean, there's a lot of strong feelings that are made heard to Radio 3 on lots of from lots of different angles. I get a lot of backlash for trying to diversify also. People write in saying they don't tune into Radio 3 to hear this, that, or the other. This is what we're fighting against. People do get very defensive of the music they love, you could say, or is it of something else? I don't know. But I would say, if you want to hear other stuff, also be public about that, or write to Radio 3. I mean, it's important that support is heard too. So that we can continue to do this legwork. But you say it's not on journalists; it is also our job. I think we need to make the efforts that we are.
Sure, it's responsible.
Yeah,
it's like about there's platforms. I take it very seriously that I have certain platforms that means that somebody will have. If you get played on Radio 3, you get royalties.
Yeah.
And the amount that we're talking about, I know plenty of experimental musicians who will live on that a week. There's very real effects from these platforms, and they're to do with opportunities, which have subsequent effects on the sort of funding that somebody might get, where they might get programmed. So this isn't just about ticking a diversity box at all, and I don't think about it like that. This is about opportunities and possibilities for professionalizing your work as a sort of somebody who's making non-mainstream music. It has very real-world effects I take quite seriously. Yeah. Yes. I think there was one at the front and then one at the back.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, because I see, and yesterday with my friends we were discussing about these 2 points of view. One, for example, you as a journalist or a radio journalist, because you're absolutely right about the royalties, the availabilities of music. But as I'm a writer, I write about music, so put an embed code of YouTube, it's much more easier to write about some music. But the thing I am wondering is the fact that, for example, Walter Smetak or Valentina Gončarová, I know their music, and you also wrote a beautiful piece about her in Guardian some years ago. I also know about their music because there was someone from their countries who released a lot of music, for example, Buch Records or Muscat.
Yeah.
And this is because I'm from Poland, and I am wondering how, for example, sometimes some Polish composers or some Eastern Ukrainian composers, how to get into attention. And I'm wondering, and I'm curious what you think about it, because usually you don't know that at the end of the world there is interesting composer. And of course, my friend told me yesterday, the journalists had to make a research and pick up. But as you said, there are a lot of stuff, and you cannot get everywhere. It's very difficult. But sometimes, if someone, for example, released or reissued some music from a few years ago, like Gončarová, for example, you wrote a piece in The Guardian, and then after a few years there is another
Valentina, yeah, sure.
Yeah, another album, Ocean, which was released this year, and it's, for example, in the middle of the year in the Quietus, it's on the 11th place in the best albums of the year. And I think that without the person who released Muscat, for example, released a few years ago, I live close to Ukraine.
Records is a perfect example.
Yeah, I even didn't know about her, but because of him, and because, for example, Luis Alvarado from Buch Records, I know about Walter Smetak, and probably Without them, maybe most of us wouldn't know it. So this is interesting, these 2 points, because there are one point, like if you are from United Kingdom, for example, you need to make a research, but sometimes you don't know where. So I'm curious how you see this aspect, like of people somewhere in the world who are interested in some archives.
I mean, someone from, so for example, someone from somewhere else going to a different country to research.
Yeah, and also like the last thing, it's
I think there's good ways and bad ways to do that.
I think it goes back to the point of knowing who to ask. I mean, I've been in touch with Louise a lot.
And the last thing, because if you write something in the media, you need to always have a reason, like why, for example, you write about someone in newspaper, in a magazine and something like that, and this kind of free issues are also the reason. So without it, like editor usually said, oh, why this time we should write about him, because nothing like happened for 20 years, nothing was released, and then this kind of free issue is some kind of reason. So it's much more.
What's the question? I mean,
it was much more about my fault.
Did you do more of a?
Yeah, but
statement
but
than a
I'm curious
question.
how you see like about digging into, because you mentioned this availability of music. So how do you see the roles of these people all around the world
Doing the field work. Like.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, that's the joy of making these connections. And Luis has introduced me to all sorts of music from South America, beyond Walter Smetak, and I'm really grateful to him that he has. And I've played a lot of those albums on the New Music Show, and I'm sure you have on Late Junction as well. So these are the connections that absolutely enrich what we do.
Yeah, there's people doing that field work who are completely crucial to that infrastructure that we're talking about, that make sure it gets released, that make sure you can play it, that field work is really important. Yeah. There was a question at the back. No, further back first. Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right.
I'm keeping tabs.
Here? I was really interested in what you said about the definition of classical music being more systemic than actually musical.
I knew I'd get in trouble for that one.
No, I liked it. And in a sort of smaller way, a lot of what you said can also be applied to what we call experimental music. And I wanted to ask about the book's title, Sound Within Sound, because to us at this amorphous festival, it's very typical sounding, but the more I've listened to you speak this last hour, it sounds like quite a radical title for a book about classical music. And I wanted to ask you sort of, first, why and how you came up with the title, but also how you chose to write into that distinction between music and sound.
Good question.
Yeah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the phrase comes from Eliane Radigue. She uses the phrase in explaining what she's looking for in the very slow and delicate music that she writes. It's these partials, these notes. I mean, in a very basic way, the notes that are beyond the fundamentals. So she's existing within this realm of kind of wonderful spacey harmonics and partials, and for her it's about kind of breaking open, and actually it applies to many of the composers in the book, looking beyond the obvious, or beyond the conventional, beyond the accepted, and breaking into something much more nuanced and delicate. And so you could take it on face value like that. I think it's also looking for the stories in between the stories that we know. So it kind of works on many levels, which is something that publishers like in a title. And your question about distinction between sounds and music, I think it becomes clear pretty quickly that that's very nebulous indeed. And I don't really try to make that distinction too kind of clear cut. I don't think a lot of these musicians were. I mean, Walter Smetak, in a way, what he was exploring was more kind of sound sculpture, some of which didn't make any noise at all. They're completely silent. As we've talked about, Anea Lockwood, her act is in listening rather than in imposing sound. So I think the distinctions become very blurry very quickly, and I'm happy to leave that open in a way. I hope that's not dodging an answer.
I think it's appropriate to dodge that question. Or not dodge it, but it is open. Like we've sort of, I feel like generally cultural discussion got over the idea of trying to decide what is art. But in some spheres, you still have this conversation where you're trying to decide what is music, and you're like, it's a completely redundant question.
I should know. I mean, it's interesting because in the mainstream narrative of 20th century classical music, John Cage is there, like right at the centre of it. There he is. And everybody accepts that 4 minutes
there
33
he is picking mushrooms always.
Happen. Yeah, there he is picking his mushrooms. Lovely. And he's a kind of establishment figure, you know, and it's kind of taken for granted that 4 minutes 33 of silence is part of the canon. It's a canonical piece, hilariously. And yet some of the composers that I'm writing about are so far on the remote edges of canonical. And I think being canonical brings with it a lot of problems as well.
The idea of the canon is, I think, is very problematic in and of itself in 2022 in the sphere of the way we listen and experience music and travel around the world. But that's another question, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. But anyway, simple answer is Eliane Radigue.
Yeah. So I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So, sorry, I jumped over you before.
In North America, large symphony orchestras struggle to program 20th century music of any kind because they feel, and probably rightly so, that their core audience doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
At the same time, they're desperate to diversify their audience because the audience is literally dying. Yeah. I don't know in Europe if the situation is much better. Can either of you think of any large performing institutions that are managing to turn the ship? And if so, what are they doing
to make
that happen?
That is a really good question.
Yeah, and you know what's worrying is I think what happened during the pandemic was really interesting. There were so many soul-searching conversations on both sides of the Atlantic about how we can do things differently now because we've got this moment that is a hiatus. And gosh, isn't this the moment to really think through what we want to change and to enact that change? And we saw that actually the mechanisms within these huge institutions that plan sort of 5 years in advance can turn on a dime when they need to. In Scotland, with the orchestra that I work with a lot, the programs were sometimes being planned like a week in advance. Suddenly it's like, right, who's free? Who can conduct? Next week, what we're going to do? This is the grouping that we're allowed. Okay, interesting, it's a funny size of orchestra. Who's written for that size of orchestra? Oh, let's do this really weird piece that we don't normally perform. Things got really interesting really quickly. And I don't know, there was a lot of kind of possible excitement about how that could change the outlook. And I regret to say that it doesn't seem to have actually. Things seem to have gone back to what they were. People, and I would say that part of that is a financial panic, actually. I think panic's not too strong a word. Things are really, really difficult for programmers everywhere. The cost of living crisis, the energy costs, audiences not returning, especially in classical music. As you say, it's a generally older demographic that's really scared to come back to the concert hall or has just gotten out of the habit. And what programmers are doing is thinking that they can't take risks. They're deciding that risks mean people don't buy tickets. And so where there was a real opportunity for change, I fear that that's not happening on a large scale, which is, I think, a massively missed opportunity. I have to say, and you're saying, are there any large institutions that are doing things differently? I'm gonna mention my beloved BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, which hosts a festival called Tectonics, which you might have come across. The conductor Ilan Volkov is very involved in that, and they have year on year for the last almost 10 years now, hosted a weekend of experimental music making, which really questions what the orchestra is, the role, the relationship of the orchestra to experimental music making in its home city, whether that's Glasgow or Reykjavik or Athens. There's been iterations around the world. And so I think in its way, Tectonics is a really beautiful example of recognizing the resources that an orchestra has and thinking about the responsibility and sharing that physical space, the instrumental resources and the kind of audience demographic that could have a lot more connections with its local community. So it does happen, but I don't know what the answer for programmers who are worried about taking risks, I don't know what the answer is going to be there, because everybody's very scared about finances.
So
What a negative place to leave it. I don't want to leave it on that. Please, can we leave it on a more positive note? Please.
Anyone? Has anyone got one final question? I think we really do have to finish now. And since you didn't shoot your hand up, then I'm going to say no. So the positive note that I'm going to end on is that Kate's book is really, really good. I recommend you all read it. I loved it. It is genuinely one of my favourite music books of the year. And she has brought about 6 of them.
I managed to get 5 copies in my hand luggage. So if any 5 people would like a copy, then oh, great, yay! I don't know where they went. Are they on a table? They're on a table somewhere over there. So that would be lovely.
All right, thank you to Kate for answering all our questions, and thanks to everybody for